Good evening, everyone. I apologize, we are slightly late, but Milano Wine Week is like Milan, frantic, effective and efficient. So welcome to this tasting session from Petra, Suvereto, Tuscany. As you will hear from the way we speak, I am the Tuscany element. These wines have been with me for a long time in my career as a taster. Here we have Jeanette Vivier, the manager of Petra, and Beppe Caviola, the enologist, the winemaker, consultant. One of the superstar of the new generation of winemakers. So I don't want to underline his style because he tends to disappear from his wines, but he is very good in letting terroir express itself. So we will talk about terroir, soils, and Petra as wine and as a company. And we will find out together why this wine bears the name of the winery. Thank you very much, Andrea. I would like to thank you all for being here today at this tasting session. We will taste the two vintages of Petra, 2018 and 2019. I've been heading the company from the beginning of this year, and I would like to make a brief presentation of Suvereto, our area. Tuscany is big, and not everyone knows where Suvereto is. Suvereto is in Val di Cornia, which has 5 different municipalities: Piombino, San Vincenzo, Campiglia Marittima, Suvereto, and Rio Torto. So 5 municipalities with the subzone of Suvereto. Val di Cornia is a denomination that has been existing for a long time, is mainly based on international grapes, Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, but also Sangiovese, which is still very much present in Val di Cornia. While our area, in terms of the makeup of the soil and of the climate, we are south of Bolgheri. It's very warm. For Sangiovese is rather peculiar vis-à-vis the center of Tuscany. So that's why the main production is Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and Cabernet Franc. The winery is part of the Terra Moretti wine group, 6 wineries owned by Vittorio Moretti. And Petra, the winery, was acquired in the late 1990s. A few hectares at the time. Now Petra has 110 hectares, not all of them in production. Most of the grapes are international varieties, the ones I mentioned before, with vines that date back to 1989 and later. Petra is the best expression of our area. From the very beginning, the first vintage of Petra was harvested in 1997. And not long after the purchase, because there were already vines in the company, in the winery, then Petra changed In the beginning, it was 50% Cabernet Sauvignon, 50% Merlot. With the time, the blend has changed, and now we are 70% Cabernet Sauvignon, which identifies this territory very well because it's very warm, and this Cabernet is not green or herbaceous, and 30% Merlot. 2018, the history changed. There will be a third variety added that will be a perfect addition to an already very complex wine, making it even more interesting.
A questo punto direi di assaggiare anche i vini
and I would say we can now taste the wines and talk about their features. Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Petra Viola. And before we start, I would say that I'm really happy and proud to lead this tasting session together with you, with Andrea. There's no need to introduce him. He is really a wonderful person in the wine industry, a very excellent sommelier, expert in wines. He is a journalist and a writer. So I'm really proud to present these two vintages, which are very important for us, and be able to do this with you, Andrea. I would like to give you the framework of our wine of reference, our most important wine, Petra, and describe our idea, our style. Let's start from Francesca Moretti. Francesca gives us her guidelines, and with my staff, I try to give a shape and some content to their production idea and philosophy. What does this mean? We are trying to make a wine which is the true expression of something, which is the true expression of a specific area of this part of Maremma, between the sea and the hills, which has long and warm summers, sometimes very dry, but fortunately mitigated by the sea breeze coming from the Tirreno Sea. And I'm saying this because climate is fundamental, like terroir, the soil, and I will try and describe it. This is a very particular area, a soil of marine origin, very fine grain on the surface, we say medium-grained, sand, silt, and clay, whereas deep, there's a lot of structure, a lot of rocks. It's a well-draining soil. And again, in depth, a high percentage of noble clay. Very important studies have been carried out, and these clays are similar to those of Pomerol, where excellent merlots are produced. So clay in depth, which manages to keep the rain and the humidity to prevent plants from being stressed too much. This is the main feature of our soil. Climate is warm. That's an important element. And before we start the tasting session, a factor that is sometimes forgotten, which is fundamental, is the interpretation of the area. Those who make the wine, Francesca Moretti and her staff, and the territory, with an idea. And the idea is always very personal. What is our idea? Our idea is, while fully respecting the territory and the grape varieties which represent this area, which were introduced in the 19th century by Princess Elisa Bonaparte Baciocchi. These are now historical grape varieties, and they have found the perfect soils. And I'm talking about Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and Cabernet Franc, with the features of the area. And what are we trying to do? We are trying to interpret this territory without having too much extraction, without having an over-extraction, and without having redundant wines, opulent wines, massive wines, heavy wines, which often lose in freshness and fragrance. And they, of course, will judge them with you. But our idea is an idea of elegance, which does not mean that we want to have thin, non-personal wines. But we are convinced that when you find the right balance between complexity, density, and structure without losing in drinkability, our idea is that you express the territory at best. When you make excesses, from time to time in the late 1990s, there were very high polyphenol levels, very structured wines, very interesting wines in a tasting session, but very difficult to drink. And then we found out that after a few years, those wines would not age well. Why? Because this excessive extraction, in my opinion, in our opinion, is also something that tends to flatten the differences. We are convinced that verticality, this fragrance and this crispiness is fundamental for the drinkability, but also for the aging potential of wine, and also to highlight the potential of the area. Having said this, I would say that we have these two vintages, 2018 and 2019. Andrea, well, two very important vintages, not simply for the introduction of Cabernet Franc. Cabernet Franc is another historical grape variety in Bordeaux, is the ancestor of Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet Sauvignon is a hybridization of Cabernet Franc. Cabernet Franc is historically the most prominent grape in Bordeaux, and now it is very, very fashionable in Tuscany. More than half of the new plants in Bolgheri are Cabernet Franc. We have realized that climate, not simply because of the high temperatures, but also because the ripening process has moved, can add not volume but complexity. So it is perfect in this moment. In this moment, winemakers, on the one hand, have the high-spending audience aged over 50, and they are still connected to the idea of a very rich wine, whereas the younger generations are based on minerality, freshness, and drinkability. So now there are plans, vets, and protocols that were established to make intense wines with structure, but part of the audience don't want them. In this moment, Cabernet Franc gives the opportunity to manage the transition very well. Anyway, it must be cultivated well. It is not easy to use it at best, but at the moment it gives the opportunity to add new elements to the wine without making it heavier. And this is what Petra began doing in 18 and in 19, also increasing Cabernet Franc. I know Petra as a wine since 1997. We had a vertical tasting session. I tasted in 1997. It was a totally different wine based on grapes that were already there. But what fascinated Francesca and Vittorio Moretti when they went there was the quantity of contrasts of the area. Sometimes you go and you're impressed. Everyone passes through Val di Colnia. When you go to Isola d'Elba, this is the background of Piombino. And we are all going towards Piombino, to the right. If you go to the left, you will see Suvereto. Suvereto is one of the most beautiful towns in Italy, and its history is peculiar. It's an old mining area, very, very important. There's also an abandoned city, which is wonderful, and you go with the mining train. It's spectacular for fantasy role plays or cyberpunk role plays. It's a totally abandoned town, and it was the town of the mining workers. So it's an area between the sea and the mines. So also in terms of vegetation, of the contrasts, sometimes it's soft and sweet, like the typical Tuscany hills, or you have very rough mountains, woods that are impossible to penetrate, and far away you always see the sea. So sea breeze, the reflection of light. Compared to Bolgheri, Bolgheri is beautiful, but there is no one from Bolgheri here. Jeanette, don't speak with your former friends, with your ex-friends. But Bolgheri is more boring. You have the beach and then the pine wood and the hills. In Val di Colnia is always changing, always different. In 1997, or even before, when the Moretti went there, it was an unknown land in winemaking terms. So I think that the idea of making a great wine there was a sort of crazy idea, like saying, okay, this is a beautiful place, so we must make a beautiful wine. Sooner or later we will manage. They made a lot of investments. Then they were brave enough to change some attitudes and re-establish the company and rethink the wines. Apart from these wines, they also produce Sangiovese, Syrah, Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, like single grape, single variety wines. The typical Bordeaux wine in the late 1990s, 2000 was a synonym for homologation because Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot are everywhere. But in Bordeaux, you see that Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and Cabernet Franc are really interpreting the area. In Pomeroli, you have Petrus, and 5 meters away, you have La Conseillante, which is beautiful, but it costs 1/10. How can this be possible? It's Merlot, and Merlot is a grape that everywhere you plant it, you make some decent wine. But when you talk about excellent wines, and this is the challenge of Petra, the territory is fundamental. And you must have grape varieties that are able to interpret the area. Merlot, Cabernet, and Cabernet Franc are grapes that really feel the area. They're perfect to making good wine. To make excellent wines, you must understand how you plant them and how you use them, because they're very sensitive. And grapes that are at the top, 1,200 kilometers to the north in Bordeaux, planted in a drier area, in a warmer area where clays and rocks are similar, but it takes time for grapes and for humans to adapt. After this time, we see incredible wines. Just think of Bulgaria, think of other areas in Tuscany that have been rediscovered with Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Merlot. And with this spirit, we taste those wines which are the outcome of a journey that has not come to an end yet. But I can say that an interesting road has been taken because they were brave enough to start from the territory rather than simply following the idea. The idea is important because no wine can be created on its own, but grapes don't come to make wine. Humans use grapes to give their idea of wine in a specific area. So we need a poet, somebody who understands the essence of a territory and can convey it through wine, followed by their inspiration. The inspiration by Francesca, she's not here, but I'm sure Jeanette sees her on a daily basis and she will be able to tell us. But we are talking about conscious. Let's talk about 2018. 2018 was the fresher vintage. 2018 fresher with one additional year in the bottle. 2019 is not marketed yet. I think it will come to the market in 1 year. And that's why we should not compare those two wines, because everyone would drink 2018 now. But it's to try and understand how the territory reacts to the various vintages. So here we have 2019 is a very celebrated vintage, and probably the last not very warm vintage in the history of Italian wine. 2020, 21, 22 have all been very warm vintages, which gave anyway surprising results in the cellar. But we are going towards a different paradigm of cultivations. I'm not saying worse wines, not only different wines. So probably 18 and 19 is the last couple of vintages which are fresher and more balanced. So we are talking about contrasts. The beautiful part of these wines is the fruity element, which stands out but is never alone. So we don't simply have a sweetness, but we also have a spice, balsamic element. We start from cherry, from mature plum, immediately accompanied by some spicy notes, black pepper, vetiver, some balsamic notes like aloe, more Mediterranean bush. It is easy to follow those ideas like bay leaf, olive, so a sweet nose, but in the glass, once the fruit has left, it's more nervous, rougher, I would say. So there's a sweet part, but then strength on the nose comes out. On the palate, you feel that the entrance is exactly the opposite. We have this crispy note, pepper and spicy, but then in the end, in the finish, and in the center of the palate, we have sweetness, and in the finish, these two elements, cherry, that are combined with a very beautiful finish. And the best thing that remains in the finish is this balsamic finish. It's a sort of wild mint that people use on mushrooms because it comes out at the same time as mushrooms. So we don't know whether this combination is an idea of the cooks or if it comes from nature. So it's green and refreshing. So maybe this is the contribution of Cabernet Franc. But 2018 is also a fresher vintage. Sometimes in programs you study the green note, the herbaceous note of Cabernet, but in these areas it's very difficult to have it. If you find it, it's a problem. There are very fantastic wines with the Bordeaux inspiration, but they have a greener note, which is because of the climate. Here in Tuscany, it's very rare. And again, Petra can be sweet and delicate, but with a lot of character. It's a wine that you feel, and the experience is complex, it's complicated, but in the glass it's very simple. Why Cabernet Franc with 2018? Well, first of all, I would like to go back to Francesca Moretti. Francesca Moretti likes to try, to test, to experiment. She already invited me to try and make wine with this very specific lot of Cabernet Franc, pure, and then use it in this blend. The reason was exactly to give more character, more personality to Petra without making it heavier. Going back to what we said before. Well, clearly, we can only say she's right, because Cabernet Franc, in a percentage of 12%, increases this complexity. It is true that Cabernet Franc, in theory, is less massive than Cabernet Sauvignon because it has less polyphenols and less anthocyanins. But it's a very, very particular grape which in percentage increases, heightens the character. And we have seen the evolution of 2018. Maybe the tonguing is even more silky and seductive. So the idea is to go towards this direction. I must say, people usually think that Merlot is added to Cabernet Sauvignon. And Merlot gives the silkiness, people think. But we saw when we tried with the blend that this addition of Cabernet Franc, when you put it together with Cabernet Sauvignon, it amplifies, it widens, and notes, perfumes, aromas of both. They go perfectly with each other. They're really complementary. So 2018 is a fresher vintage in terms of average temperatures, but also more rainfalls. On the Tuscany coast, climate is sometimes more difficult in September because it starts raining. And those large amounts of water, maybe in Florence, Montalcino or Chianti Classico, it doesn't rain in September, but on the coast it rains very often. So sometimes this causes problems, because Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc, you can harvest them in October, but if it rains, then you have molds or rot. So rain is necessary. This year, rain saved the harvest in some areas, but in some other areas it came too late, it didn't come at all, or there was too much all at once. And this causes other types of problems. So this year, the harvest will be very special and also very different from areas to area, from area to area. 2018 in Italy, apart from Sicily, is a vintage that, if you like, more elegant, more nervous wines. It's a vintage to look for, and you will be very happy. Maybe it will not age for long, but definitely 10 years will be there. And I'm talking, generally speaking, of those wines, talking about Barolo. Those are extremely pleasant, 2018, also to drink now. And for Barolo, this may be a contradiction, but it's a way to understand the vintage. Well, 2018, also in Piedmont, in Langhe and Barolo, is actually a vintage which expressed itself, well, it was a fresh vintage, so wines are very pleasant, very much appreciated by consumers. Also, Barolos, they have tannins, but they are still pleasant to drink. These are wines which are fresh, fragrant, with good acidity and pleasant. I would like to add that I've been working in the Tuscany coast for 20 years now. So fresh vintages like 2018, in the end, well, maybe at first you think it's not a great vintage, but actually in a very warm climate of the Tuscany coast, a fresher year expresses minerality versus a warm year, and this mineral aspect turns into a savory wine, a fresh wine in the aftertaste. So the wine is incredibly balanced, and fortunately, over time, those wines age well because they are more acid than warmer years, warmer vintages. So, in my opinion, and I apologize for contradicting you, those vintages can last well over time. 2014, which was considered to be as a minor vintage, everybody said, don't make 2014. Now, after 7 years, well, those wines are still aging well, because now temperatures are much warmer, maybe not in other situations, but in Sovereto and in the coast of Tuscany, those wines have had a very interesting development. And then there is also the thing of vintages ending with 8. In Bulgari, all vintages with 8 and with 5 are considered to be the best. 5 and 8. So everything helps. When we are proposing the wines, what matters is the histories around them, but wines with the 8, especially in Bulgari and on the Tuscany coast, well, these are surprising vintages. And in vertical tasting sessions, we will have a lot of fun in Petra in a few years, and we will bet on the aging potential. I've had this wine since 1997, and every time you open a bottle, there's always something very specific. Not simply because it's 2010 or the most famous vintages, but it's always worth drinking it because the development, the evolution is always very interesting. Just think about those hectares of cultivation, and you always choose the best, and those are always spectacular grapes. And then wines can take on winding roads, but wines are always exceptional. And now 2019, which is sort of preview I usually don't recommend decanting old wines. I'd rather decant a young wine, and it will improve because there's a lot of reduction. So with a decanter it will breathe better. So it's a warmer vintage, fresher than 2021, 22. But that was one of the vintage when you wanted to push on the accelerator of concentration. And many winemakers also making mistakes in Tuscany and Piedmont. Well, 2018 was very thin, 2019 was a lot more full-bodied, so many pushed on the acceleration of concentration, so having the same effect as 2015, where wines were overloaded with fruit and massiveness. 2019 is not an incredible vintage, so 2018 was very difficult to manage. 2019 did well on its own, so a lot of concentration was pushed, not necessarily what the market wants. So when things go well, then humans make the wrong decisions. Sometimes it's best when you can choose. When you've got all the freedom in the world, you can choose to harvest whenever you want, and that is when you see those who have the right ideas. So a good vintage on its own doesn't guarantee a good wine, but when nature makes everything, you can make mistakes, and having the wrong time of harvest, well, Syrah is even more sensitive, but also Cabernet Franc, you cannot do whatever you want because the effect of the peperonata, of the pepper, of the bell pepper notes is there. So difficulties in 2019, which is part of that series of warm vintages. So those wines are ready to drink, but also in terms of tannins, there's a lot of matter, quite massive wines, more accessible when young, but also destined to be appreciated over the years. Now you can feel the intensity of the aromas, which is higher because there's 1 year less in the bottle. Now it's more open, so you feel the fruit, which is very fresh, blueberry, blackcurrant, olive. There are also some floral notes, violet, candied violet, some rose, Damascus rose, Moroccan rose, spicy rose. At the same time, we have some darker notes, musk and walnut, and or carob and oak notes, which is less integrated than 2018, but you should think that you will drink this wine in 1 year. So cigar box or cedar wood. When you buy cigars from Cuba, they use cedarwood leaf to protect the cigars and to give them a specific aroma with this spicy, sweet note. An intense wine, more intense than 2018. Let's taste it. Tannins are really dense, close. You feel them very well on your gums, on your tongue, but they don't dry your mouth. With this percentage of Cabernet, it's very difficult to find pleasant wines. It's not even aperitif time. But at this time of the day, this type of wine should be difficult to drink. But while we perceive structure and power, but we feel a perfectly ripe tannin, which means harvested at the right time. It's a little bit rough, but there are no green notes. And you see that this carpet of like pinches on your tongue keeps you awake and will bring this wine very far. Everything is blended less well than 18, but it's more fascinating. We have more matter, more structure, more extract. But this is my perception. Yes, it's more extract. So this wine will age better and will bring this fruity intensity, this body over time. Well, 2019 was actually a warmer vintage. So in the cellar, when destemming and crushing, we used the full grapes and we filled the vats by gravity, trying to limit the extraction of polyphenols that we knew were already rather massive, with using as an infusion with very soft pumping and not too long maceration, and then aging in oak, in barrique, with a percentage of new oak, which is not above 30%. You know that barriques give tannins when they are new. So especially when vintages are very warm, they tend to be added to the tannins of the grapes and become even too dry. So we try to avoid extracting too aggressive, bitter, dry tannins. In order to obtain this result, there is a lot of work behind it. The Moretti family and Francesca Moretti are very careful with the way you manage the vines. What you need to have is a well-balanced vineyard. Well-balanced means that in its management, organic substance is given so that the vine has the right nourishment to grow. They develop homogeneous branches and stems, which we achieve by means of all the pruning sessions with Marco, and we let the bunches grow and we study it so that the vine are not stressed too much. A little bit of stress is fine, too much stress is no good. This is the right balance to achieve those results in the vineyard which we want to achieve and bring to the cellar, where we try to manipulate and process it as little as possible. We try to bring the right grapes to the cellar. With 100 hectares, it's very hard work with a lot of stuff that we set up. In recent years, Marco Simonetti has been working for us and the Moretti family for the past 20 years. And over time, because wine making is not 1 year, it's a cycle, and wine growing from the moment you plant the vines to the first harvest, and then it's the life cycle of the vine. So all years are different, so there's a lot of work behind it. And in the winery, we have made from the very beginning
diversi studi proprio sul
different
suolo in modo
studies
da
on the soil
vedere quali
in
sono
order
i
to
terreni
see
più adatti
what
per i
is
singoli
the most suitable
vini e
soil
poi
for
dopo
the individual
gestire ogni singolo
grape
vitigno
varieties, and
secondo
then try
appunto
and manage every
necessità.
variety based
Questo
on
è
their
un
needs
lavoro
and
che
requirements.
facciamo anno dopo
And this
anno in
is
modo
what
da
we do year
migliorare
after
e
year
i risultati si
in order
vedono
to
poi alla
improve,
fine in
and we see the
collaborazione
results in the end
con la
in
cantina e la vendemmia
collaboration, in
e
partnership
l'incremento
with the
della
seller,
cantina.
the
Poi
harvest,
penso
and
che
what
sia
we do
un
in
bel
the cellar. You
risultato
see
queste
it in
due
the glass.
annate
I
ci
think these
vedono
two
che
vintages
effettivamente quello
are a
che
good
è il
result, and they
potenziale del
fully
nostro
show
territorio di
the
Sovereto
potential of
e di
our
quello
area
che
in
sono i
Suvereto
suoli
and what the
e
soils
il
are like,
microclima di
and the
Petra, perché questo vino
microclimate
viene
of Petra,
proprio dai vigneti
because this wine
che
comes
stanno intorno alla
from
nostra
the
cantina, la
vineyards
cantina di
around
Mario
our
Botta.
cellar,
Magari avete
cellar
anche
made by
avuto
Mario Botta.
occasione di vedere
Maybe you had
questa
the
cantina
chance
e comunque
to
sulla
see
immagine
the cellar,
dell'etichetta la
and
potete
it's on
ritrovare.
the
Sono
label
tutti
as well.
vigneti che stanno intorno alla cantina, sono circa
All those
35
vines are
ettari
around
dove
the
facciamo la
cellar. Is
selezione in vigna
35 hectares,
Petra.
and
Ovviamente
we
già
make a
durante la coltivatura ci
selection
sono
in
vigneti
the vineyard for
dedicati
Petra. Also, when
per
pruning, there are
Petra e
dedicated
poi
vineyards
non è
for
detto che
Petra.
effettivamente danno poi il risultato che vogliamo,
And
perciò
if they
anche lì
don't
nella
give
selezione
what we
durante la
want,
vendemmia e
then during
poi
the
la selezione
selection,
durante la
during the
vinificazione,
harvest,
la
and
ultima
during the winemaking
destinazione e
process,
poi
the,
deciso all'ultimo
we
momento
design the
se
destination at the very
rientra
last moment.
nel
If it's
nostro Petra o se
okay for
rientra
our Petra,
nei nostri
or if
monovarietali
it's
e
for
avremo
one of
poi il
our
nostro
single
vino bianco
varieties, or
che è
for our entry label,
Lebo Rosso.
which is Levo Rosso.
Beppe, si è parlato appunto di vendemmia.
Beppe,
Io
we
sono
talked
convinto che
about
sono tutti curiosi di sapere
harvesting.
com'è andata l'ultima.
I think they're
L'abbiamo
all
avuto un
curious
bicchiere ovviamente,
about
poi
the most recent
delle viste, però
harvest,
si è sentito di tutto di più, dalle
but we've
preoccupazioni,
heard
paura di
all
quest'anno
different
non
stories,
avrò più vino.
from
Alla fine quali
concerns of
sono
not
in
having
fondo,
wine, but
cosa
now we are
succede?
getting
Ma
towards the
io
end of
dico
the
francamente,
harvest. What
sinceramente,
can you tell
che
us?
è stata una vendemmia che
Honestly,
mi ha stupito,
this was a
perché
harvest that
effettivamente
really surprised us,
eravamo più o meno
because
pessimisti
we were
a giugno, inizio
rather
estate,
negative
si
in
pensava,
July,
no,
early
visto che
summer,
si prospettava
because
l'ennesima estate calda,
it was yet
siccitosa,
another very
senza
warm and very
provvedimenti
dry
urgenti,
summer
e
without any
il marito
rainfalls.
della
So
pianta
the idea was that the
soffrisse
vines would
di
suffer,
stress
would be
idrico
stressed,
e quindi compromettendo quantità e qualità.
and would
Cosa che vi
yield
posso
little
garantire
quantity and little
che
quality. But I
praticamente
can assure you
non si è verificata
that
fortunatamente.
this was
E
not the
questo
case,
anche parlando
fortunately.
con esperti, agronomi, ma
And
così
even when talking with experts,
altrettanti validi,
agronomists,
e non ha effettivamente trovato una spiegazione scientifica
there is no
se non
scientific
questo
explanation.
diciamo pensiamo noi,
And we are simply
senza
thinking
dati,
about it
che
without any
probabilmente gestito
data
ovviamente in un certo
that,
modo
okay,
senza spiegarlo, perché è un
we've
agrumeticololo,
managed
si
it
sta adattando
in a
noi abbiamo
specific
cambiato
way
parecchie
because the
pratiche, no? Anche
winemaking process
solo per il
is
vino, ma
adapting
soprattutto la
itself.
gestione
We've
diversa del
changed
vino.
many
Però la
practices
pianta ha
from
reagito
the cellar to
bene
the
e ha
vineyard,
sofferto
but plants
relativamente, c'è
reacted
stato un
well.
calo di
They suffered
produzione
relatively.
che
There was a
potrei stimare
production
tra il 20
decrease
e forse il
of
30%,
20
dipende dalle zone,
30% depending on the areas.
ma ad esempio la cosa che mi ha colpito
But
è
I
se
was
avete
very
mai
much
guardato sulle
impressed.
parti siccitose
And you know, when you have very
visivamente
warm and
adesso
very
arriviamo
dry
ad
years,
agosto, fino ad
visually
agosto,
in
si sa
August,
che
at the end of August, early
innanzitutto
September,
si nota
first of all, you
che
notice what?
lo strato di foglie,
You
no?
see that the
La
layer
cosa
of
qui che interessa
basal
insomma
leaves
del grappolo ingiallisce
near the
in
grapes
secca, cosa che
becomes
quest'anno non si
yellow,
è verificata.
yellow and dry out, which was not the case this year, which means that the basal leaves, the oldest leaves, the ones that are not working any longer, well, usually when a plant needs to reduce, they eliminate them. This year, it was not the case. And then we saw very, very little hyper overripe grapes. Alcohol level, yes, there is sugar concentration, but if we think of other warm years, for example, 2017, 2015, we have quite concentrated wines, but they are hardly above 15 degrees, with also in the south of Italy, really interesting acidity. So I was surprised, and it must be judged. And in the future, we will consider it as a very interesting vintage. Now, a very last addition, because we need to conclude our workshop. It was a very particular harvest. I've never seen anything like that, but it was a very long harvest. Usually, or recently, harvests are becoming shorter and shorter. It used to be 5 weeks, then 4, and then even 25 days. This year, it was a very long harvest. It began before mid-August, and it came to an end last Friday, so more than 2 months. More than 2 months, and this is very peculiar. But I agree with Beppe. There were no big problems. And after the August rains, everything was quite balanced. And the grapes we have in the cellar are very beautiful, and the result is excellent. Well, this is another evidence of the resilience of the vines. They are still surprising us, and when we think that everything is lost, well, this year we've learned some new things. So unless you have any questions, so we are not going anywhere, so you can ask them directly to us. Thank you very much for your attention, for your presence. And my invitation on their behalf is to go and visit them, because the wines are excellent, but if you taste them where they are made, it's magic. Of course, they must be ambassadors of their area. This is what they are. But being there is really wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Just 30 seconds to thank Jeanette, Beppe, and Andrea for talking about this incredible wine. We are very proud of that. We are very proud to work in partnership with Terra Moretti. And this is a very important day for professionals, for the event, and we will give the awards in Palazzo Serbelloni, and this is the day for professionals, while the event is becoming more open to communication and consumers. You all have a very important role in communication to consumers. You are ambassadors, and these training moments are necessary because we must put at the center the role of those who work in restaurants. So you are very important for your restaurants, and you are able to influence directly the behavior of end consumers in their home consumption. So this is very important. Up with Petra. It was very proud. We are very proud to having you here.